Okay, when we talk about veterinary nutritionists, and in my experience, and as I developed over the years, I see you as a veterinarian getting involved in various levels. And I want to emphasize right from the start is that you don't take over the role of the nutritionist. You are part of a team. I will say more about that at the end of this lecture when I'm talking, when I'm going to spend some time on that. But due to the fact that most of the problems that we deal with in dairy herds is multifactorial in origin, and of which nutrition is an important one. And so I see it as you must be able to identify a problem that is related to nutrition. And if I ask you to make a list of all diseases and syndromes and problems that is related to nutrition, you will come up with a very long list. So as a beginning point in your development, you must be able to at least identify that problem. And depending on your experience, you will then refer it to a nutritionist or work together with him. And then with a little bit of more further development, you should be able to do a system evaluation on the farm. You go for a farm walk, and be it a total mixed ration system or a pasture-based system, or a component feeding system, or whatever system is running, you must be able to identify that the system and be able to evaluate it. And if you then find further definition on the problem, then again refer it or work then together with a nutritionist. And then the last step will be when you start to get involved in rations. The analysis and the evaluation of rations, or you get a report from the nutritionist on the rations that the specific group of cows is receiving, or the calves or replacement heifers. So the important thing is that you need to take action. And all that doesn't come overnight. In my own experience over many years, since I was involved with dairy herds, it was a developmental process to eventually to be able to come up to that point. I please want you to note that we don't formulate rations. It depends on your further experience on that. And if you've got a qualification of that to do, I think rather work with a nutritionist, and then you can come up with as part of that team that we talk about. So we're first going to talk a bit about the heifers. And I've got 2 or 3 case studies here, very briefly again, that I'm going to address certain points and take specific examples on nutrition. As you know, that the heifers are the future of the herd, and the management during all the developmental phases is critical. You'd get the newborn calf, the calf during the milk feeding period, post-weaning up to breeding, and then from breeding to the pregnant heifers and up to the close-up heifers right at the point of calving. And I think you are all aware of all these primary indices for heifers, or the performance parameters, age at conception and body weight and heat detection rate and all that. You will see that obviously the first AI conception rate and AIs per conception in heifers is significantly higher than the cow herd, because obviously they don't produce milk and they just need to get pregnant. So those are the targets that we would like to achieve. And then obviously all to achieve that, it all depends on the health and the growth and the management and the nutrition of these heifers over this whole period. So I want to take this as a simple case study where I'm going to use, where I was a promoter for an M student on unrestricted milk and group housing in calves versus individual housing. So this was a case of that herd where they had seasonal calving, and they were group housing in paddocks versus individual housing. And then we, together with that, we will, then I'm just going to point out very, very briefly, because I can keep you busy with this thing for maybe the whole day, with regard to the restricted and unlimited milk. And then obviously in these camps that they are out, they get their calf starter and water. So when we talk about restricted milk feeding, and that's what I believed in my young days as well, and this is the perception that, and many farmers still do that you must feed restricted quantities of milk or milk replacer to calves housed individually. And the reasons for that is cost of milk. And then he said, if you limit the milk, you stimulate the higher dry feed intake, which will compensate for the lower volume of milk intake. And in that way, you will get better weight gains. And the dry feed intake, the concentrate, as you know, plays a very important role in rumen development. And the other reason why we individual housing is to eliminate cross-sucking in groups of group-fed calves, and then also limit the incidence of important diseases such as diarrhea. That was a perception. But nowadays, okay, I'll come to that. So what my case study, which I've used now as you know, from his dissertation, was unlimited versus restricted milk intake in group housing. It was a beautiful herd in the Southern Cape area with seasonal calving, very strict season calving during January and February, which was a relatively dry time of the year, when situations are very hygienic. And then it was group housing of the calves. So as you can see there are two different groups of calves here in these paddocks. Shade is provided, and they get their starter concentrate here. And then they've also got their water available in the camps. And then twice a day, during a specific phase, the calves will go to a milk feeding station, which you will see here, where they will, then the one group will receive restricted milk according to traditional approach, and the other group can consume as much milk as possible. And that milk intake was measured as accurately as possible. And nowadays, as you know, we've got modern sophisticated systems where the calves can go to a milk feeding station, which is regulated by a computer, and where the milk intake and also the other station with concentrate intake can be monitored all the time. But this is how we did it on that farm. And so the aim of the study was to test the hypothesis that the feeding of high milk volumes will increase growth rate and reduce cross-sucking in group-fed calves without compromising their health. So very briefly again, as I've said, we haven't got the time, and I've just selected this because I think it's a very nice case, just to briefly show you. So this is a milk feeding schedule. Now, as you can see, there were two groups of high milk volume, the red and the blue. The blue one was a large group of 30 calves per group, and the red calves, the high milk volume. The smaller groups were two smaller groups of 15. So in total, it was 60 calves on high at-lip milk intake or unlimited milk intake, and they can consume as much milk as possible. And then the same, the others with the restricted milk volume, this same, you've got a large group and you've got two smaller groups. but obviously they were restricted in milk. So with regard to milk intake, they only received 4 liters a day. So 2 liters in the morning, 2 liters in the afternoon. So obviously from birth to up to 4 days, that was a colostrum feeding period. So after calving, the calves were collected as soon as possible, and then they were checked for passive immunity on the farm, and to be part of this trial. Now here you can see a significant difference in the intake for Jersey calves. I mean, that sort of average milk intake over that first phase up to 21 days is over 7 liters a day in comparison to this 4 liters. Okay. Then in preparation for weaning, because this was early weaning at 42 days, they changed to once daily feeding, but this was still ad-lib milk. So you will still see high intake of milk versus the restricted milk, but only once a day now. And then a week before weaning, there was restricted milk feeding to all the groups. Now, when we look at the mean body mass of calves in different groups during the 60 days of the trial, so it wasn't up to weaning, it was right up to 60 days post-weaning as well. And then you can see, and this difference is significant, that the growth rate of the high intake of milk volume was significantly higher. And during the milk feeding phase, it was true that the intake of concentrate was less, but after weaning, there was no difference in concentrate intake between the two groups. So these calves maintained that higher body weight gain and after weaning, and eventually modern newest literature will also say that this has got a long-term effect on the performance of those heifers when they calve for the first time. So here you can see it very clearly. And then in summary now, as I've said, there is a massive amount of results that I can show you, but this is just a short case study on this concept of high milk volumes to dairy calves. So our conclusions was that the feeding of high volumes of milk to dairy calves can have a significant effect on growth rates without compromising health or reducing the intakes of solid food after weaning. What was very evident, and there was a highly significant difference, there was hardly any cross-sucking in the group that had ad-lib milk, because obviously their tummies were full and they spent much more time on socialization, like play and running around like little calves must do. So from a welfare point of view, those calves were much happier calves. And then the long-term effect on age and weight, we didn't do it in this, but we did follow it, but it wasn't part of the protocol. But in newest literature, there's a lot of information on that. The second case study that I want to do with you is a very simple and straightforward case, which one can obviously see there is very poor growth of the heifers and condition and fertility performance of these heifers eventually. You can see that these heifers are very thin. They're far below the growth targets. And there was also a high mortality rate in this herd. And then this is the way they were fed. It was Erogrossus curvula hay mixed with maize meal. Now, it doesn't take rocket science to identify the problem here. It's straightforward. It's a very simple case, but I've included here just to show you what sort of things you can come across. And remember, we live in South Africa, so we need to live with all levels of farming, subsistence, developing farmers up to commercial dairy farms. So one can still come across this sort of scenario. And as I said, it doesn't take rocket science to conclude that, I mean, this is a very unbalanced diet. for those growing calves. It will be seriously deficient in protein, in minerals, and even energy and macro and trace minerals. So what I did here, I did a simple exercise evaluating that ration, and the composition or the nutrient mix here was only 80 grams of crude protein per kilogram. That is only 8%. Your NRC recommendations is 16%. So there is a significant deficiency of protein. You can see there's a significant deficiency of energy. But look at this highly significant deficiency of minerals against what is needed. No surprise that there wasn't any good skeletal development in those heifers, because obviously you need the skeleton to develop as well and to grow. You need the protein for the matrix and then for mineralization to occur. And the same applied to all other nutrients, which I haven't even listed here. So that's just another example of how one will, we go back to my first slide on problem solving and evaluating the system, and even a simple ration evaluation in this case. My third case study was heifers that were fed at lip grass hay and then at lip growth concentrate, as you can see here. And there was a very poor conception rate, and heifers became overweight. They become fatter up to the point of calving. And there was a high proportion with a body condition score of more than 4. Even heifers, I remember still clearly, with a condition score of 5, which is totally unacceptable. So identifying this problem, you will immediately tell me, but you know, I mean, this is very risky to feed component feeding. And this is true, because those heifers can consume excess amount of this, and you can run into problems like subacute rumen acidosis due to unstable rumen and all that goes with that. And secondly, over the long term, this is what we saw here, is that you get these heifers that is overfat. So no surprise when these heifers came to calving, there was a typical case of fatty infiltration of the liver and with peripartal type 2 ketosis. So the clinical signs was very obvious. These are clinical signs that we experienced there. And there was actually clinical ketosis in this herd, which showed nervous symptoms. You can see this cow, this heifer now that calved, so she's a primiparous cow. She's very depressed. And when we, the other symptom that we don't often see, but which is described, is they start to lick themselves and they inflict all these wounds in the skin, as you can see there. So there were 2 or 3 that died, of which we did a post-mortem, and there was a typical post-mortem on that. So obviously the ones that survived had very poor subsequent milk yield and fertility performance in their first lactation. So the take-home message, and the same apply to cows, be careful of overfeeding cows and heifers. The ideal condition score at calving should be about 3. So you want to prevent this. If I must make a choice, personal choice, I would rather go for slightly thinner cows and heifers than going for overfat animals. Because I can tell you, and I've seen other cases in my career as well, and it's basically a losing battle when you get up to that point. Okay, when we come to the cow herd, you know that there are 2 basic feeding methods: feeding forages and concentrates separately, like this pasture system. And then you've got your TMR, total mixed ration, or complete feed system. Now, tomorrow you're going to have the privilege to listen to Kenneth Botha, and I think he will concentrate a bit more on the TMR system, and when he discuss applied nutrition with you. And so obviously we haven't got the time to go in all the important managemental factors that is important with total mixed ration systems, but I'm pretty sure that he will do it. What I will do, although, is I'm going to do a very short case study again with you to just to illustrate again specific problems. So when we evaluate nutrition and problem solving, we need to give attention to all these facets. And as again, just on this slide, we can spend hours on it. So I've just included it to just get a message that you need to look holistically at things. And your history is so important with regard to health aspects. Milk production and quality is critical, and your reproductive performance. So you're going to have a lecture from Alf Latergan just after mine now, where you will emphasize this thing here. But your milk production and quality, nowadays you can monitor it on a daily basis with these modern systems. So if there's a problem, the farmer can identify it immediately, and you can take actions immediately. So that's a beauty, because as you know, the modern systems can monitor a lot of things on a daily basis, even condition scoring, where the Laval has got a system where they've got use cameras, and you take 3 image cameras and they do a condition scoring on a daily basis. So you can see a fall in condition scoring long before you're going to see it visually. So I don't, just a few ideas on that. Okay, so when we talk about TMR systems, and as I've said, there's a lot of detail here when you're dealing with problem solving. So I'm just going to apply some of these typical problem with this case study, which I've seen many, many years ago in the Eastern Free State, where it was a TMR open camp system, as you can see here. And the components of the TMR was grass hay and lucerne hay, which was put in as long hay in the mixer wagon. And it didn't went through hammer mill beforehand. And then the maize silage. So you had the typical grass, lucerne, and maize silage, which initially is good because when you look at the roughage components of a TMR, we know that grass, lucerne, and maize silage will complement each other with regard to eventually a balanced ration. And then the farmer used a commercial, very good quality commercial dairy concentrate. But there was problems with poor milk production, low butter fat. We haven't got the time to go into all that detail, so just take my word for it. There was poor condition scores, poor fertility performance, and look at the feces. The fecal score, if you are acquainted with fecal scoring, is about a score 2, which is quite watery. It doesn't form a pile. It's sort of custard-like, and when you examine it closely, you will see a lot of undigested particles and even gas bubbles here. And in some cases, you will see a lot of grain as well. And that could be a typical sign of subacute rumen acidosis. So over and above that, there was laminitis, subcutaneous abscesses, and there was a high cull rate in this herd due to all these problems. And, when I went for my farm walk, that's what I call it, as part of my problem-solving thing, I came across this shocking state of the maize silage, which was really very poor quality and very poorly managed. And yesterday you had the excellent lecture with Albert on silage and the factors that affects silage quality. So if you apply all those things that he discussed on this, it's very obvious that this was very poorly made. It was poorly packed. The feed out management was very poor. Silage was brown in color, poor textures. It had a putrid smell. And when you squeeze it, he showed you yesterday, when you squeeze it and there's too much moisture, the water will come between your fingers. But in this case, when you squeeze it, and you open your hand again, it breaks up after you've squeezed it, which shows you that it's very dry and there's not the ideal moisture. There was excessive coarse fiber. The ratio of fiber to grain wasn't correct. And then there was clear signs, that spelling is wrong there, of mold and yeasts, which obviously runs the risk of mycotoxicosis if not well balanced. You can clearly see all the composting here and over the top there and even in between here. So most probably the pH was high and the starch content was low. And then the feed out management, when I evaluated that in comparison to a sort of ideal situation here in that comes from the Netherlands, you get further dry matter losses. The face of the feed bunk is just open. So you get a massive amount of secondary aerobic fermentation and further spoilage occurring. And then they put the silage into these bags. And then when you put your hand in there, it's fairly hot, which shows you the secondary aerobic fermentation that Albert mentioned yesterday. So there was an increase in the pH and heat increases. And then obviously this stuff is highly palatable. It's got the risk of mycotoxicosis and also decreased dry matter intake. So to address that problem is very difficult because basically that silage is compost, in my opinion. So when I evaluated the TMR mixing, now this TMR here is not on that farm, but I've just used this picture to emphasize the importance of the management around TMR when you mix it with the mixer wagon. And I'm pretty sure Kenneth will talk a lot about this tomorrow. So we looked at the particle separator box that we used, and there was excessive long particles, which was the hay and silage, and it was very dry. So the moisture content of the TMR wasn't correct. The mixing time was too short, and then there were excessive wear on the mixer wagon, the blades. And so that's one reason why it doesn't break up the hay. And hay should be entered first into the mixer wagon. So those are some of the things that I observed during my problem solving. And then I checked the feed bunk management and the feed bunk design. Now immediately you will tell me that this is really shocking, and it's true. This is without going into detail because we haven't got the time for that. If you compare that to well-designed feed bunks and space and all that, that is important. We will classify that as a poor bunk design. And then the sorting of the TMR is very obvious. Sorry for that. So here you can see clearly how they sort. They leave the long particles, the hay, but also that coarse particles of the silage because it's so unpalatable. And the particles is not effective particle size. And as you know, effective fiber particle size is critical to stabilize rumen fermentation and to stimulate rumination and to stimulate saliva flow together with the endogenous buffers. That is important. So no surprise that there was symptoms of subacute rumen acidosis in this herd. And when you look at the way back, so just look at that. That is a massive loss. significant wastage that occur in that herd. So the action that obviously I can't, when I examined this, it was on my own. So we consulted the nutritionist, and he came out and did feed and ration samples, analysis, diet formulation. Management of that poor quality silage, can you still use it? It's a big question mark. You actually need to throw it away, and then rather buy in before you make the next batch of silage. Buy in something like lucerne hay together with your grass hay, put it through a hammer mill, and then you need to serve the mixer wagon. Consistency is important. So the efficiency of feed mixing may need to be monitored the whole time. You can't chop and change from day to day with regard to TMRs. So the order, the mixing time, monitor particle size, all those things are important. I'm pretty sure Kenneth will address this as well tomorrow. So I'm going to end up a little bit more detail, where I will also do a ration evaluation here on pasture-based systems. Now, as you know, feeding forages concentrate separately. It's known as component feeding, and you've got numerous options. So raffages can come from veld pastures, green chop, etc., silage, straw, croplands, etc., concentrates, in-parlour, post-parlour, or you can use a post-parlour system or a partial TMR. Supplementary concentrates, I'm pretty sure you know that there are different ways and that we need to supplement this. Sorry, just take a bit of water here. And so it's either in-parlour, post-parlour, or a transponder system. And that concentrate obviously is a supplement. So it must be formulated in such a way that you address the potential deficiencies in pastures. And that's what we're going to just emphasize quickly again. And so this is my case study. Now you will tell me, well, nowadays you get herds that is over 1,000 cows. But remember, this is 2-3 decades ago. So in that time, during my career, it was still common to get these family farms. But this farmer also, he was situated in the Eastern Escarpment area, beautiful area. The Crocodile River runs through his farm. He's also got trout on the farming, and you can go and enjoy ecotourism there. And so that was part of his whole setup there. But he's got a pasture-based system, and that's a kikuyu and perennial ryegrass and clover. He produced farm forages, maize silage, and Urogrossus curvula. And then he had post-parlour concentrate. He purchased the concentrates, and then he mixed it on the farm himself. And then additional to that, free choice mineral licks. And so again, if I briefly give you the history, so you see this goes back, well back to 3 decades ago, 91 to 2001. Now during 2000, and this is critical, the farmers stopped producing maize silage, because maize silage is an excellent supplement for pasture-based systems, and you will find a lot of these pasture-based farmers that use maize silage as a supplement. So again, low body conditions cause suboptimal milk yield. There was low milk protein, high milk urea nitrogen, which I'll come back to just now. There was a high incidence of metritis, endometritis, with the routine veterinary visits. I knew the private veterinarian very well. We were actually friends as well. And this was consistent. And then anestrus and poor conception rates. If I just take some of the key fertility parameters, you can see that there is a significant problem with fertility performance when you compare it to what the ideal target should be. Now, when you deal with fertility performance, you and I know that it's a multifactorial thing, and all these major factors play a role: management policy, health condition and fertility of the cows, intensity and accuracy of heat observation, and so on. If we just look at the cow factors that affect the cow, very important: metabolic, nutritional disorders, milk production, nutrition, environment, stressors, much stress, heat stress, and all that we need to consider. So when we look at unestrus, which was significant in this herd, you all know that energy reserves is critical during early lactation and the pre-service period. So the timing, duration, and magnitude of a negative energy balance interact to determine the extent to which negative energy balance alters the GnR secretion. So we want to minimize. We know that there's going to be a weight loss. That's why they need to calf down in a condition 3, because no way can they initially consume enough to maintain their body condition. So the target body condition during breeding is about 2 to 2.5, 60 to 120 days in milk. You will always get in high producing herds less than 10% of cows, which can go below 2. So that is acceptable as a sort of a general guideline. So optimal nutrition is critical for fertility performance: protein, energy, minerals, trace minerals. Alex Jenkins yesterday had a beautiful lecture on trace minerals, and which I really enjoyed quite a lot. So during a visit, I went to the farm, and before that time I was there as well. But in August, because there was a serious problem now, and together with the private vet and the nutritionist, we went out. And during that time, there was limited rye clover. Remember, this was in August. So we need to, the Kikuyu is foliage, standing hay. So as you can see, this is very fibrous, very poor quality. And there was limited rye clover because it was still not producing maximally. Ad-lib grass hay and the rest of the day on this, and then a post-parlor concentrate feeding. This was a farmer's own mix, and I'll come to that just now. And then additionally to that, there was still that free choice mineral lick. Reason why the farmer did that, we had years ago, we experienced spontaneous fractures in this herd of the femurs, and that was due to osteodystrophy and due to a calcium and phosphate difference. But there might be an overkill now. So we were there in August. So if you look at the typical growth curve of these, you will see August, the Kikuyu is foliage, and then the rye clover is just starting to grow now. It's the beginning of, because the rye clover, as you know, is cool season grasses. So you get a peak in autumn, and you get a trough in winter time. Now remember, this farmer stopped producing silage. And this is a place where silage really can come in to address this problem of not having enough fodder for the cows. So as a veterinarian, you also need to know a little bit about fodder flow. And I actually attended a course in my young days at Sedara, a whole week course on fodder flow. So when we look at rye clover, the composition of this with regard to these nutrients, there are certain nutrient limitations to this, and which I'm not going to do now because we've only got 15 minutes left, but I come back to each one of those specifically. Also the minerals tend to be low, and that's why mineral supplementation is critical, but beware for potassium. It's well known that potassium in pastures can be high, and this is part of the problem of grass tetany, and then obviously in the dry cow, peripartal period of milk fever. So when we look at pasture dry matter intake, there are many factors that influence the dry matter intake from pastures. A common mistake is to overestimate it. And so if you've got inadequate dry matter intake, and then you're obviously going to have a deficiency in nutrients. So this is a common table that you will get in textbooks. So, I mean, due to the fact that there was not enough pastures available, they only spent 2 hours on the pasture. So that will only represent about 3 to 4 kilograms of dry matter intake. Remember, the dry matter percentage of green pasture is about approximately 20%. So if you take the as-fed intake, it's bulky, but it contains a lot of water. So that grazing time obviously depends on a lot of factors, as I've listed there. So when we look at fiber limitations, pastures is often low in neutral detergent fiber and effective fiber. So you get inadequate cut chewing and rumination. High moisture leads to high passage rates, which is fairly typical on pasture-based systems. That's why you often see fecal scores of 2. And then low butter fat, which shows you that you haven't got enough fiber intake. So your long hay will add effective fiber, slow down the passage rate, and help to maintain dry matter intake. So that is important. And we must remember that NDF coming from forages is critical. Energy limitations. This is the most limiting nutrient. So if we look at the non-fiber carbohydrates, this is the starch and the sugar and pectin, the highly soluble simple molecules of fiber, which is highly digestible, tends to be low. This is only 15 to 20%. If you go back to that analysis, your total ration need is about 35% in the final ration. So this needs to be compensated in the supplementary concentrate. So this amount has got long-term effects on all that we've seen in this herd. So as I've said, the farmers stopped producing maize silage, and I want to refer you back to what Albert did yesterday morning, where he talked about quality maize silage. And when you look at this is an excellent supplement for pasture-based systems. So this was one of the critical factors that the farmer stopped producing maize silage. Fortunately, after that, he started again after he realized that he's got a problem. The protein limitations, pastures, that's fairly typical. It can be high, but we must remember that 70 to 80% of that protein is rumen-degradable protein. So we want a good balance between RDP and RUP, your bypass proteins. And so in the total ration, final ration, the RDP should be 62 to 68%. So your balance with non-fiber carbohydrate is critical, because you need the starch, you need the sugar, as you know, when you go back to the basic physiology, for the rumen microbes to utilize the nitrogen to form microbial proteins. And so you can run into a deficiency of rumen and degradable protein, and then obviously specific amino acids. And that's why very often you will have a decrease in milk protein. So one of the symptoms in this herd was a low milk protein and a high herd milk urea nitrogen. Now, and this is due to this, because this is an important indicator of protein and the energy balance. And so this is due to that highly rumen degradable protein and the low non-fiber carbohydrates. And it can also be indicative of even ketosis. So it's well known that the mineral limitations of pastures, and again, think about Alex yesterday, and these should, especially in pasture-based systems, that must get attention. Be careful with potassium. And then the farmer, as I've said, he mixed this on his farm. Where he got this recipe from, I still don't know. And when you, with a bit of experience, when you evaluate this mix, you will immediately identify problems. There is not enough maize to supplement further starch. There is too little rumen undegradable sources of protein. Molotech is a commercial protein together with molasses. Feed lime might be too high. Kinophos is a mineral, calcium phosphate again. Salt is fine, maybe it's like, you don't want irium, because irium is 100% rumen degradable, and that is part of the problem very quickly now. So when we look at this nutrient composition of this concentrate, which is supposed to be a supplement, then this is too low to supplement pastures. Crude protein might be too high, it is too high, but your problem is the balance between, you've got too little rumen undegradable protein to compensate, to get the balance right between RTP and RUP. And look at the non-fiber carbohydrates. Remember, the final ration must be about 35%. But this is only the supplement, so it's diluted by the pastures. So the fat is too low, and you don't want the urea. The mineral composition of that concentrate, there is excessive minerals, even with the trace minerals. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to take it a bit quicker now. So the general comments on that concentrate is that that's the comments on that. The NFC is too low to compensate for the low pasture levels. The energy density should be above 11 megajoules ME per kilogram dry matter. We generally recommendation for total crude protein is 12 to 14% crude protein is adequate in most pasture situations, but you want to have good sources of RUP, of the bypass proteins. And you can use products such as roasted soybean or soybean oil cake. Fish meal, brewer's grain is an excellent example of a good source of RUP. You need to remove the urea and to decrease the lime. So together with the nutritionist, we've worked on various models. This is just one example where we've estimated what is the ash, fat, and dry matter intake. So if you look at this and you just use the rule of thumb with regard to dry matter intake, the dry matter intake in the beginning is too low. So no surprise that you experience all that problems. So again, when you can do this later, when you go back to the slides on your own time and you compare it, you can clearly see what is a dietary deficiency when you evaluate the final diet and against NRC recommendations. And the same for macro minerals, and the same for trace minerals. And so on. Alex have said a lot about that yesterday, so I just want to re-emphasize what he said, is that especially with pasture-based systems, trace minerals is relatively more important than with TMR systems. So the consequences of this imbalances is this typical symptoms that we experienced in this herd. So the actions was a smaller herd integrated with the ecotourism. So the farmer has got a beautiful farm there, and still nowadays he's got the brand name products. So the people from Sandton and all over the country can go there and hike and cycle and do trout fishing. And then they can buy their milk and cheese and yogurt on the farm. And routine seasonal monitoring of the pasture is important. And you need to optimize supplementary feeding by reintroducing maize silage and the grass hay, and either use a commercial supplementary, or I personally like the partial TMR idea, especially when you're dealing with pasture-based systems. So you haven't got enough pastures available. So for the rest of the time, you keep the cows on a TMR, addressing all that problems, which is typical of pastures. So a partial TMR offers more control, it's more uniform, monitor the dry matter intake on pastures more easily, and so on. So in conclusion, I've very, very briefly, I must say, try to bring across a message that as a veterinarian, you need to know a lot about nutrition, and to be able to identify problems and evaluate systems and eventually ration evaluations and so on. It will take time, but we must realize that we need to develop a competency in nutrition. It's got a primary influence on growth, health, milk production, and fertility performance. And these are you are confronted with all these different problems and syndromes due to nutrition. So obviously, don't just go out to the herd to do rectal tourism. And if there's a clear-cut nutritional problem, spend some time on that. Call in the nutritionist and evaluate the situation. So you are in an ideal position with scheduled veterinary visits for monitoring. And it's an essential part of herd health and production. You can't come away with that. And you need a holistic approach. Problems that we deal in modern dairy herds need a holistic approach. So you need to look at all the factors that can affect the health and the performance of the dairy herd. So why is it necessary? Okay, I've already said that. What is necessary to develop competency in nutrition? Obviously, you need to have a good knowledge of the dairy industry and so on. You need experience with modern, sophisticated data systems and reports. It's just mind-boggling what the modern systems can do. I've already given the example of where you can monitor condition scoring, milk production, electrical conductivity of the milk on a daily basis. Feed intake is monitored on a daily basis. Activity of the cow, the pedometers that help you with estrus detection. So these systems are there, and you need to get involved with that. And then the third point I can't emphasize this enough. You need a good working relationship with nutritionists, pasture scientists, farmers, and others to the mutual benefit of all. It's a team effort. You are part of the management team on a dairy farm. And obviously, you need generally good life skills, and you, again, need this holistic approach. So how can you develop your skills? And this is where you need to do a lot of extensive self-study, go and attend courses and conferences and so on. And what I did in my very young days, I visited as many farms as possible, some of them with nutritionists as well, and you can learn a lot from farmers. And so don't try to impress a farmer with your scholarship. You can really learn a lot from farmers. And farmers are more than willing. They are good people to help you in your development of getting competent in nutrition. So as again, develop a good working relationship. And data systems are reports. And unfortunately, my impression is that as veterinarians, we don't get involved really get involved with all the reports that is available. And this is part and parcel of the concept of a holistic approach to dairy herd health. Thank you for your attention. Made it in time.